Hi everyone. So I wanted to go over what our plan will be as we do this virtual work. Some of it will be virtuals, and I'll kind of be taking you through some steps. Some of it will be you all interacting with each other and collaborating a little bit while working on some unit planning. And the last part to what we're going to do is going to be some follow-up question and answer sessions that we'll set up as we go forward. And these question and answer sessions will be, over Skype or something like that, so that we can put together a kind of a structured way of moving forward with this virtual work. Okay, so we have a few goals for today, or for our work as you kind of work your way through this. So our understandings, you guys understand that instruction and assessment are parts of the interdependent process of curricular design. Intentional alignment of instructional goals, and obviously we'll be talking about KUDs for that. Learning experiences and assessment is what leads to implementation of powerful and efficient instruction. So we're really trying to streamline and make more effective what you do in the classroom. You'll know the elements of instructional design, the role of different learning targets, that being KUDs, how to assess these KUDs, and the importance of unit planning as opposed to just discrete lesson planning. Okay, and our do objectives is you all will have some time to align learning experiences and assessments with your learning goals. And so really thinking about all three stages of planning and making sure that they're all very aligned. Designing learning experiences that make the subject matter meaningful to students. The last part is that we're focusing on assessments that measure student transfer, and that's not just student knowledge or student application, but that when we are teaching kids that they're actually building towards something more meaningful, that there's an end result they're looking for that asks them to kind of put wheels on what they're learning, as opposed to just answering multiple choice questions. So at this point, I wanted to pause for a second and give you guys a chance to think about those objectives. I want to be really clear about where we're headed so that you guys can take a second and really consider what those KUDs mean for your work. And so I wanted you to pause for a second and just reflect on your own, and you can do this in kind of keep a running journal as we go through this today. Or if you're with somebody else, kind of think, pair, share, discuss this out. Or what objectives you feel the most comfortable with, and so which of those KUDs are you like, yes, I do that, I think I'm good with that, it makes sense. Which confuse you, and confusion can be, I don't really know what that means, but it can also be, I don't know how that applies to my work, or I'm not sure I'm very good at doing that. And so I want to make sure that we really kind of have a good idea of where we're headed. So pause for a second and just reflect on those two questions in relationship to the objectives that I just mentioned. Okay, so what we have coming next is a video. It's a video with a woman named Judy Willis. And Judy Willis is an ex-neurologist. She was a medical doctor, and she was getting referrals. She'll sort of talk about this in the video, but she was getting referrals to study kids in the classroom, for ADHD, emotional disturbances, things like that. And what she realized was that the classroom environment might be the root cause of a lot of the things that were happening to these kids, or a lot of the reasons that they were being brought up for child study and things like that. And so she kind of talks about the brain a little bit, and what brain-friendly teaching is like. And I'd like you to just jot down any ahas or any big ideas that jump out at you. And we're going to revisit these after we discuss each stage. And so we'll come back and kind of say, hey, now, does that make any more sense based on what she said? But I think the idea is that we're really looking at connections between what she's talking about and then our work with understanding by design. So just a quick refresher on the three stages of backward design. Stage one is what our outcomes are. And so we'll be looking at KUD format for this. So what do we want students to know, understand, and be able to do? Knows are the facts, understandings are the big ideas, and the do's are the skills. We really want to be clear about what those are at the beginning so that every step we take to get kids there will be in the right direction. Stage two is assessment evidence. And so whether we're talking about formative, the ongoing assessment, the checks for understanding, that is very, very vital to an understanding by design unit, as is the performance task at the end of the unit. And you can also have little performance tasks throughout. But the idea with the performance task is that's the only way to really measure student understanding. And so we've set these big ideas. So conflict drives change. Let's say that's an understanding. Well, how do we really tell that students have gotten that understanding? How do we tell that they've really, really mastered that? And so what we can do is think about assignments that ask them to think in an authentic way, and be able to kind of put wheels on their learning. And then that all is sort of facilitated by stage 3, which is the learning plan. And so we're thinking about what meaning-making activities, what strategies are we using each day to kind of build kids towards the point where they can complete that performance task. And so we think about learning goals, we think about assessment, and really a big part of that at the end is where the rubber hits the road in the classroom. How do we get kids to the point where they're ready to achieve that? So it's also important to understand why we use unit planning. And I think it's pretty intuitive, but it's also worth mentioning that if we think about sometimes how we plan instruction and the idea that, what am I going to teach today? What am I going to teach tomorrow? And we look at that more in isolation, that doesn't really help students make connections and see the bigger picture of what they're learning. And so it's sort of one of those things where they don't see the connection. One day ends and they don't see how it relates to the next day. And that's one of the things we really want to focus on. It's beyond just chapters. So next week we're going to do chapter 3. The week after that we're going to do chapter 4. Because again, when you finish a chapter, it's like, that's done. Where else do we go? And so what we want to do is make sure that we're using unit plans that are conceptually fit together well. And so, a unit plan can be about a topic, and we want that topic to be something that is going to make sense to the kids from on sort of a continuum. We want learning to be much more fluid. It's not stop and start, stop and start, stop and start. We want it to be a fluid process where what they learned yesterday aids in what they're learning today, and then what they're learning today is going to help in what they're learning tomorrow. And that process really is the most brain-friendly way that we can teach, because the brain likes to work in connections. And so if we can show students this fluidity and these connections between each of the days when they're learning, that's going to lead to much more powerful learning experiences. So the big thing we're looking for is to avoid these twin sins of design, and this is what happens in the classroom a lot, is we end up with this activity-focused teaching and coverage-focused teaching. In both of these instances, we're not really building and we're not teaching for understanding. And so I think I might have mentioned this when I worked with you guys last year, but the idea of the activity-focused teaching is when you might have a really engaging, fun activity and the kids are all into it. And so maybe you've got computers out and they're working on these websites and they're creating these brochures for social studies. Let's say they're creating brochures for the founding fathers. Let's say a kid gets a choice of one founding father they can make a brochure for, and you've got these websites for them to look at, but essentially all they're doing is copying and pasting from the websites into the brochure. They may really be enjoying it. They might have fun making or messing around with the brochure and the template and all that stuff, but we're not really ensuring that they're learning much about the presidents, right? It's more just learning how to make a brochure. So we want to avoid activities like that don't have a clear focus. The other part to it is we want to avoid the coverage-focused teaching. And that's really, really what you see a lot in the standards-based world we live in. One of the nice things about the Common Core is that it's not asking quite as much coverage. I think there's a lot more flexibility that teachers have with how they implement these standards. And so particularly with math and the elementary grades, they've shortened the amount of topics covered each year, but they want students to go into much more depth, and they want students to be very fluent with those concepts. And so as opposed to 12 concepts, now there's 6 each year, but kids really need to know those 6 because they're not going to cycle back through them every year like currently a lot of states do. And so I think that the Common Core standards have set us up in a little bit nicer of a place in terms of avoiding coverage-focused teaching. But we want to make sure that we're not just teaching, testing, that we're teaching and checking for understanding, that students get an opportunity to reflect and think back on what they're learning. The actual teaching is not the learning, right? Learning and teaching are different. And so we want to make sure that through our teaching, students are actually coming to understand what they're learning. That's where the memories can get into long-term storage, and that students will actually be able to recall that stuff when they take a test. One of the things we forget sometimes is that if students never learned it, they're not going to be able to recall it on a test. And so coverage, a lot of times, where we think we're doing a good thing by giving them all these facts and skills to learn over a short amount of time, oftentimes that's not very effective. Curriculum races aren't very brain-friendly. as Judy Willis would say. And so one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is providing those opportunities for students to get those things that they're learning into long-term storage. Okay, so here's the template we'll be working with. This is just stage one. And you should have a copy of this in front of you or close by. And you can see stage one, we're being really specific on the left side there about our established goals. And those are going to be your standards, whether they're Montana standards or, Common Core standards. And those would be your established goals. And those are sort of what we're going to start with. We're going to extend those. Those are going to be our jumping off point for creating this curriculum. And then up top, we need to think about what's our transfer goal. And our transfer goal is really that idea of putting wheels on the learning. And so I talked about the performance task in stage two. That transfer goal should very much align and signal with what you want that performance task to be. So what is evidence of students being able to use this long-term use of what they're learning? We also want students to make meaning of it, and so there's that emotional connection that they can make among what they're learning, and they can see a point to it, and that's where essential questions and understandings come in. And then what they're going to acquire, and acquisition, it's sort of self-explanatory. That word means is that those are the things, the knowledge and skills that they're gaining in order to make meaning and in order to be able to transfer that and use it in a new or unique way. And so acquisition is sort of the more foundational type stuff that kids are learning as they go through this process in stage one. Okay, before we get into the process of actually brainstorming and planning a unit, I wanted for you guys to take a second and think about examining a unit that you've taught before. And it can be this year, it can be a previous year, it can be your favorite unit that you teach every year. But thinking about how that unit was designed and how well you did with that unit in terms of avoiding coverage and activity-focused teaching. Was everything within that unit very, very purposefully designed to build kids towards something bigger? Or were you just trying to throw some things at them and hope that some things stick where they should? And so be thinking about that as you kind of go through this. Now this again could be like a journal reflection, or if you have somebody who's following along with you through this process, kind of having a brief discussion about thinking about what a unit looks like that you've taught before and how you plan that unit. Okay, now we're going to jump into stage one a little bit more. And we'll pause and give you a chance to actually work through some of this and try to put together a unit plan going forward. Okay, so stage one, we have acquisition, we have meaning, and we have transfer. Three important things that we're looking for with every unit we teach. And so the key is that we're focusing on big ideas, and those are the enduring understandings or essential questions. Those are the big ideas we're working towards. I always tell people that enduring understandings are more like the teacher kind of objectives. We can tell kids what enduring understandings are, absolutely. But if we're aligning our essential questions with our enduring understandings, and those essential questions are sort of the student-friendly way to get that across. So I think starting off units and coming back to essential questions consistently, and so it talks about framing the teaching and learning, like those things that we use. And we have students reflect on those, and we have them think about those in relationship to what they're learning, can really be a powerful tool at the classroom level. And so, for instance, if your essential question, I think we talked about conflict driving change earlier. If you can ask students something along the lines of, can you think back to a time where you made a big change? Why did that happen? And get students to reflect on that, and then that segues into, okay, now we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War and sort of some of the conflicts that caused change there, or something along those lines. And you can even think, if you were to do a biology unit or something like that, it could still be something you could use, literature. And so as you're doing this, really think with the essential questions of questions that align with your understandings, that are ones you can ask, and kids can really think critically and connect to what they're learning. And then we have knowledge and skills. And knowledge and skills are both, again, acquisition. And so what knowledge and skills are they acquiring over the course of a unit? And that's more foundational stuff. And then the transfer skills, one or two skills, are the big skills for the unit. And those skills are what's going to signal, again, for that performance task. And so if you want to have students at the end of a unit, if we're talking about conflict and change again, if you want to have students at the end of a unit create a skit that reflects conflict and change in society or something like that, then our transfer goals might be something along the lines of students will be able to create and perform a piece that reflects their understanding of conflict and change. And so that's how all three of those sort of fit together. They each have a really vital role in a unit plan in terms of building understanding and making sure that students are able to transfer. Okay, so Common Core standards are obviously part of this. We don't have curriculum really. I mean, we can have curriculum without standards, but in most of the courses that kids take today, standards are what drive our curriculum. And so with Common Core, and we talked a little bit about this, is that there's the shifts in English literacy and language arts, or English language arts and literacy, and math. And then there's also those history and science supporting standards that go along with English language arts and literacy, and those standards can help support the non-fictional texts and analysis that's happening in the social studies and science classrooms, but that very much relate to what we teach in English language arts and literacy. And so obviously we mentioned these back in the fall, but really focusing on knowledge through content-rich nonfiction and informational text. And so moving a little bit away from fiction. Now that doesn't mean that every single thing you teach has to be nonfiction or informational, but as much as we can, particularly at the elementary level, we want to start having students really think critically about that type of text. Reading and writing is also grounded in evidence from text, and that's fiction and nonfiction. That it's not just sort of how did you feel about this, but it's site-specific examples to support what your thinking is. And then regular practice with complex text and its academic vocabulary. And so what this is talking about is that students kind of are building that, what they call the staircase of text complexity or vocabulary complexity, where they're developing a much stronger vocabulary through this reading process. In math, I think I mentioned this before, but we're really just we're reducing the amount of coverage. So we're focusing really strongly where the standards focus, and what that means is those standards are heavily focused on these 6 topics, and these 6 topics only in this grade level and possibly the next one. And then we're going to transition to another 6 topics, so that when students leave whatever K through 2, whenever they're done with those 3 grades, those 6 topics are good. They're fluent. They know them conceptually. They are able to apply them. All of that. And then coherence, we're thinking across grade levels, so there are some connections. It's sort of a spiraling approach. And then rigor, again, we're thinking fluency, but also conceptual understanding. And so it really is lessening the amount of topics that are covered each year, being more consistent, and really making sure that kids get that before they move on to other grade levels. And both Park and Smarter Balance, I think they will include performance elements in these. And so regardless of what assessments are used, there are performance elements, just like we're going to create for your unit plan here as we think about adding that transfer task and then that performance assessment to the end of a unit plan, because that is what students are going to have to do on either the Park or the Smarter Balanced assessments. Okay, I wanted to pause again and give you guys a chance to think about this question. And we've talked a little bit about it, but to really consider what the role of Common Core standards are in our work with Understanding by Design. And so again, this can be a quick journal assignment, or if it's a Think, Pair, Share activity, you can certainly do it that way too. And so really thinking critically about what Common Core standards, what their role is in our process as we go through this. So the first objectives we are going to talk about are understandings, and these are the essential truths that give meaning to a topic. They are generalizations, they are principles, they are big idea statements that aren't necessarily subject specific, that cut across content areas, that are sort of truisms and things in the world around us that are really just important things to leave school with. And so this is the 40 years from now when you see a kid on a street, what is it they're going to remember about your class? Well, hopefully it's this stuff. And so I think some of my favorite examples on here: people migrate to meet basic needs, all cultures contain the same elements, voice reflects the author. And so these are short statements. They should not be really drawn out. They should be very, very short, concise statements written. Students will understand that. We do that instead of students will understand how or why or what, because when we say that, it ends up being more like knowledge. We want them to understand this on a very deep level. And so that's why we draw it out a little bit with that phrasing of students will understand that. and make sure that we use that terminology. If we think back to Judy Willis and sort of some of her discussions, um, to be brain friendly with our curriculum, we want to make sure that there are these big ideas because they do provide this adhesive to the brain. And so understandings give us something with which to stick those facts and skills to. And so they're sort of like a kind of a Velcro, if you will, where we have something to attach these skills and these facts, because we don't want kids to learn that in isolation. If they learn particular formulas, we want them to not only understand or remember those formulas and be fluent with those, but we also want them to deeply understand what that formula means in relationship to math as the bigger picture of math. And that's really what understandings give us. So understandings serve as adhesive to the brain, and they're the why, the so what, the moral of the story, applied beyond the classroom. If we didn't understand this, what would our lives be like? Those types of questions. And if we think about, if we put the perspective or this kind of hat on where it's the moral of the story, the why, that type of stuff, and that's really going to allow us to think about the bigger picture in terms of why students are learning this. So now's the time that we're going to actually start thinking about this unit that we're developing and actually planning it some. And I think it's best to start with understanding. Some people would start with essential questions. We'll do those next. And certainly if you feel like fast forwarding and you want to start with essential questions, you can just come back to this as well. But understandings can be both overarching and topical. So overarching in the sense that they might be year-long understandings that you keep coming back to. And that, particularly in subjects like math, if you're talking about real-world modeling or language arts, if you're talking about author's purpose, or if it's a social studies class and you're talking about conflict, or if it's a science class and experimentation is one of your big things you keep coming back to. Those are things you could certainly use year-long, and that would absolutely be an acceptable way to do it. And then you can have things that are specific to a unit that you're teaching, and so something that may not necessarily connect or something you'll come back to year long. I think if you, as best you can, if you can make these year-long or overarching generalizations, that those can be really, really powerful because kids just keep thinking about them. But that's certainly not something you would do for every single understanding. And obviously we're basing these on Common Core state standards. So on that left side of your template where it's established goals, make sure that those standards go down first so that you have them there, and so you know kind of what you're working towards from a standards perspective. And that's going to help structure and align what you do for the rest of this. And so take a second, brainstorm some understandings, and when you're ready, the next slide actually has some scaffolding, and so if you get stuck, then you can look at some of the pages on the next slide, and that will help you move forward. And then after that, we're going to get into essential questions. On this slide, we have the scaffolding, and so you can see some example understandings can be found in your book on page 86 and figure F4. And there's a quiz on there as well to kind of test your readiness, so maybe there's some things you need to rethink. And then if you remember correctly, the front of the book, there's a website and a code that takes you to some online resources, and figures F.6 and F.13 online can help you develop understandings and essential questions as well. And so as we get to essential questions in a little bit, that can still be a resource for you. There's no right way to develop understandings. There's sort of like, it's the idea of entry points to understanding by design unit. What are our entry points? And sometimes an entry point is a great activity you do, and sometimes an entry point is a wonderful performance task that you have, and sometimes it's just these great questions you ask. And so any of those are certainly good ways to start. But by the end, we just want to make sure this thing is absolutely aligned, and obviously thinking about stage 1 first. And so here are some resources that can help you with that. And so if you get stuck, feel free to use these going forward. I think the easiest way to consider essential questions for a unit is to, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-to-one relationship. So like for every understanding you've written, it doesn't necessarily have to have an essential question that goes with it. But essential questions might be easiest thought of that way, that for each understanding, maybe there's a big idea question that students consider. And I think essential questions are great to start units off, to personalize journals around. I think those are all wonderful ways to use these. I actually have a weekly journal I keep with my students based on the readings that they've done for that week. And for every day of one of our classes in the syllabus, there's an essential question. And for most of those readings, I have them read and then reflect on the essential question that we have for that day and kind of connect to it. And so it just helps give us some glue for our course so that there are these common themes that we keep coming back to, and that students, when they learn something new, they realize the purpose to learning that because it ties back to these common themes. And just like with understandings, these can be overarching, so your entire year, your entire semester, or they can also be topical, like specific to a unit. But what you want is that these are open-ended, these are arguable, these are questions worthy of discussion, and so starting an essential question would not be, what are the states of matter? Students will certainly have to learn that stuff, but that's not, that doesn't have meaning outside the classroom. So if we were to change that a little bit, we might say something about like why the states of matter are important, and think of a really great question about that. Now that would be an essential question because there's lots of answers to that. And so we don't want an essential question that has a specific answer or set of answers. We want this to be opinion generated, worthy of discussion. We certainly want to guide kids in the right direction in terms of how they're thinking about these questions, but we don't want to ask questions that have a set answer to them, because that only really invites facts and things like that. And we want to move beyond facts with essential questions. We want to really get to some critical thinking about the topic and about the content they're learning. So these are just some general guidelines in terms of essential questions. I think the best way to do this, just like with understandings, is to brainstorm some ideas and then whittle them down and weed them out. Much like with understandings, you don't want essential questions to be something you have to feel like you have to cover in a unit, and so you want few but powerful, and that's just like with your understandings. You don't want 2 understandings a day that kids are going to have to think about, because if we're doing that, then the focus really is on trying to cover stuff and not having them actually uncover and think critically about how things fit together and what they're learning. And so, 2 to 5, maybe even less than 5, would be manageable. And these are going to go in your template under meaning. And then there's some pages here, page 74 and 75 in your units book, that have sample essential questions. I can't remember if you guys got the workbooks or not, but if you have the workbooks, pages 108 to 110 in those workbooks actually have essential questions as well, some sample ones. And so that can give you just a starting off point to start thinking about what is an essential question, what does it look like. And so let's take some time, just like you did with your understandings, and think about essential questions at this point and try to get some down for this unit plan. So the last 2 objectives we'll look at are knows and do's. And knows and do's, the knowledge is all acquisition. The do's can be either transfer or acquisition. Again, the bigger do's, the culminating critical thinking that we're going to ask kids to do, that's more of a transfer goal, whereas the basic skills, more lower level skills, are more acquisition. And so with knowledge, the biggest thing we want to make sure to talk about, and there's kind of a good illustration here on this slide, is we want to be clear about what we want students to know about certain things. And so what about Thomas Jefferson is important? What about 1492 is important? There could be, if we want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, do we want to talk about how he was a slave owner, or do we want to talk about his role with the Declaration of Independence? And so we really want to be clear about what we want students to know about these things. But again, these are discrete pieces of information: facts, names, dates, people, places, things, and they're written, examples of, or characteristics of, or definitions of. So we want to just pretty much list these out, and then this is the discrete knowledge the kids are going to have by the end of the unit. The last objective we're going to look at is the do's. And do's are skills. And so they can be multiple skills. As you can see, we're talking about basic skills, skills of a discipline, thinking skills, independence, skills of production, social skills. It's not the whole activity, so you wouldn't list every step in an activity that you're doing during a lesson, just what skills are behind that. And so writing a well-supported argument, evaluating to the or contributing to the success of a group or team. Like that's a social skill. That's something that a lot of kids really need is how well they contribute to the success of a team. Using graphics to represent data appropriately. And so instead of using graphics to represent data, if we were going to make that an actual activity that we're doing in class, we might say students will complete a set of problems in the book and graph each of the problems. And that would be the activity, right? That's not the skill. The skill behind that is using graphics to represent data appropriately. And so what you're going to see just in this list is you can see there are some of these that are more transfer, and there are some of these that are more acquisition based. And so solve a problem is very acquisition. Use graphics to represent data, very acquisition. Whereas if we're talking about writing an argument, evaluating work, those are higher level thinking skills. And so those are really transfer skills if we're asking students to do those types of things in our performance task. And again, that's what we're aiming for, is that this performance task is aligned with our transfer goal. Just for illustrative purposes, we can look at this Bloom's level sort of sheet here, and this is the revised Bloom's from 2001. And so the lower level skills, remember, understand, apply, whereas analyze, evaluate, and create tend to be a little bit higher. And so when we're thinking about transfer goals, those three levels, analyze, evaluate, and create, are really going to be what we're aiming for in terms of thinking skills. And so that students can analyze something critically and then maybe evaluate it and make a value judgment about it. Choose which one is best and why. Use your knowledge that you've learned and create something new. Think of a new idea or a new sort of novel way to think about something. And so that's what we're aiming for with our transfer goals, is that analysis, evaluate, creation level goals. Whereas the lower level, the remember, understand, and apply, are more likely going to be our acquisition goals. And I'm going to send along a sheet along with this that you can look at that has the revised Blooms and just some verbs that go along with those in terms of what does each level actually mean, so that you can get a feel for the different thinking skills that go along with each of these levels. All right, so this is a time to pause, get out that template, and think about stage one and adding your understandings, essential questions in terms of acquisition, your knows and do's, and then your big transfer do as well, and trying to get that down. And we really want to be as clear as we can. So thinking about how these extend the standards that you've come up with, and making sure that everything's kind of tightly aligned there. The next step we're going to do in this is I've got a kind of a self-evaluation that you're going to do with this unit in a second. And so try to finish up this stage. You can pause here and make sure you feel like you're in a pretty good place with the product you have together before we move on to the next step of self-evaluating. Okay, here's your opportunity to self-evaluate. In page 27 of your Creating High Quality Units book, you can self-assess your design. And really you're thinking about strengths that you have, things you would like to improve on, and then how this is different from what you've used before. So there's sort of a checklist that you can complete on page 27. But more than a checklist, I think it's really important to think about sort of qualitatively how you feel and how well you think you're doing. And that's why I asked those follow-up questions there below. So the strengths, things you would like to strengthen, and then how you feel like what you're doing is different. And those are the ideas that you really want to keep in the back of your mind as we're moving forward. We will come back. So you're just looking at stage one on page 27. We're going to come back to this after stage 2 and 3 and make sure that you have an opportunity to look back and self-evaluate again. Okay, before we move on to stage 2, we're going to do two things. I want to think back to that Judy Willis video you watched and what connections you feel like can be made between what you just went through and her video. And if you need to go back and watch it again, feel free to scroll back. You can actually even Google that video. It's pretty easy to find. If you look up Edutopia, Edutopia, and then Judy Willis, Big Thinker, if you just put those into Google, it'll pop right up. It's the first one. But if you want to go back and just scroll and watch it again, that's totally fine. It might be helpful. And so thinking about what connections between what she was talking about in stage 1 you can make, but also I want you to think about some of the things that we've talked about, just signaling for what's going to happen in stage 2, and what predictions you feel like you can make about her ideas and what we're going to do in stage 2. So what do you think she would have to say about formative and summative assessment that we're going to get into in a second? And so these predictions will help sort of focus us for what we're going to do going forward. And as we move into stage two, we're talking about determining acceptable evidence. And this evidence takes numerous forms. And so we're going to speak briefly about formative assessment, summative assessment, self-assessment, and how all three of these, sort of from a portfolio perspective, we can get a really overall picture about how well students have mastered the objectives that we've created for them in stage one. With this slide, hopefully you can see some connections to what Judy Willis was talking about and summative assessment. And so we talked a little bit about, if you think back to a time where you took a test, the last test you took maybe, and how much of that you actually remember, even if it was a long time ago, but you probably can think back and remember some really cool projects or authentic assessments that you participated in schools, because those were much more meaningful experiences for you. And so students more than likely will not retain info after taking a test because they don't see a point to it. The brain is a survival mechanism, and so the brain tends to retain things that it's emotionally invested and connected to, and if it doesn't see a point to some of the things that it's learned, it doesn't want to keep it because it only wants to hold on to things that seem very important to us. And so, you can think back to memories you have that are very emotionally stirred and emotionally connected. Those are why those memories stick, is because the brain functions that way. And so from perspective of 21st century skills, if we're teaching these students how to be producers of information rather than consumers, then that's going to prepare them with divergent and executive thinking. And so they're not just trying to retain stuff, they're using that. And we engage multiple areas of the brain when we do this, with divergent and evaluative questions and tasks. And so if they have to respond to anything, there's a greater likelihood of these endorphins being released, and that leads to greater learning. And so anytime our brain releases endorphins, just going back to that first bullet point, you're taking a test, there's not a whole lot of endorphin releasing that's happening there. But students who are emotionally invested in something and they find pleasure in it, the endorphins will be released, and that leads to greater retention. And so along those lines, we want to align any task with learning goals, and that leads to better performance. Open-ended tasks, student choice gets more investment in what they're doing. If we can attach meaning and challenge students appropriately with these performance tasks, that's going to lead to increased retention. And in the end, really, we want them to show what they know rather than what they memorized, forgot, or never learned. And so a lot of times in schools, it becomes an I got you game rather than tell me all these things or show me all these things that you really learned from this unit. And that's where we can see a lot of powerful results in terms of student learning. And so the opposite, or not necessarily the opposite, but the complement to summative assessment is formative assessment. And that's sort of the ongoing checks that we do along the way that help us as teachers make sure that students are on the track they need to be, and to make any adjustments for kids that maybe aren't. And so formative assessments would be, journal entries, entrance exit cards, instructional questions, concept mapping, things like that. Anything where they're going to sort of tell us, think, pair, shares. Anything they're going to tell us sort of what they know about what they're supposed to be learning. And so it should be non-graded because it's in the process of learning a concept. And so we don't want to punish kids for not learning something quick enough. Formative assessment also builds confidence. And so if students are getting feedback and they're feeling more comfortable with what they're learning, that makes a summative assessment feel less stressful. And really, the most effective assessment, and this is what the literature and the research on assessment shows us, is that the most effective assessment is what helps give kids feedback and helps clarify their thoughts, not about judging them. The most effective stuff isn't you gotta C on this. The most effective assessment is here are some steps you can take to get better. And that's the way, if we can view assessment in that way, we're going to see a lot of improvements in student performance, because they're going to be getting the feedback they need, and they're going to understand what steps they need to take to improve. Along with the materials that were sent to you, there is a brief article by a cognitive psychologist at the University of Virginia. His name's Daniel Willingham. And I disagree with some of the stuff he talks about. He's very a little more focused on rote learning. He was never a teacher, but yet has kind of made educational psychology his career. And he has a lot of good things to say about it, but some of the things he says are sort of off base with a lot of the things we know from a brain research perspective. However, this is a really, really good article that talks about why students don't understand when they think they do, or why they think they understand when they actually don't, I guess is what the title actually is. Um, I want you to think about this before you read. I want you to consider what ideas you have about why do students think they get something when they actually don't. And then after you read, I want you to think about a time in your life where these two reasons he gives for students thinking they understand when they don't, um, for thinking about if you ever remember a time where that's happened to you. And then how does this relate to your unit planning? How does this fit in? How can you take the evidence that he talks about in this article, and better plan your formative assessment or your assessment plan that you have within your unit plan? So go ahead and pause and read the article and spend some time reflecting and discussing on what he has to say. So here we're really aiming for a range of assessments. So we have authentic tasks and projects, exams are fine, quizzes, informal checks, student self-assessment, prompts and problems. What we want to think is in less of like a snapshot and more of a portfolio or more of a photo album, if you will, because what we're looking for is that there's a multitude of evidence. It's not just one or two things that indicate student performance. And so as you think about your unit plan, you think about stage two, really think critically about how you can give a broader picture of student capability and ability, but also you're checking for understanding along the way. So this is just a list of informal checks for understanding, informal or formal. Um, and so, you can see hand signals, discussions, discussion posts. Even as a teacher, if you can just cruise around the class with a checklist, those are some great ways to do it. Analogy prompts, question box in front of the class if kids feel weird about asking questions, exit cards out the door, sticky notes out the door, polleverywhere.com, putting up a quick quiz and having students respond to that can give you some instant feedback. And so there's really the one thing I think one of the important things to remember about formative assessment in the classroom is it doesn't have to be something separate from the learning activities that are taking place. It can very much be part of that. It's how we use that information. It's do we pay attention to it? So if kids are working in smaller groups, are we paying attention to what they're talking about, to their direction? And are we jumping in to say, hey, you're a little bit off here. This is where you need to be. And when we can do things like that, that's what turns learning activities like that into actual assessments. And so it's really beneficial on the teacher's part to think about times when, hey, I can really use this as a check for understanding at this point, and to purposefully plan those in the classroom. So the most effective summative assessment we can do, and what's really going to measure those transfer and meaning goals that we've laid out, is the performance task. And as best we can, we want these to be authentic. That's not always something you can force, but I think when possible, if we can think about giving students a role or an authentic way to think about their learning, it really does sort of raise the game a little bit in terms of what we do in the classroom. Students see school as this disconnected place that they go to. They don't have a whole lot of ownership, when they're in the school, as opposed to, or except for maybe today I'm going to pay attention, today I'm going to act out, today I'm not going to pay attention. Like those are basically the choices kids have when they walk into a school. And so if we can provide them with a little more authentic, real world focus, with giving them a little ownership of their learning, it can really boost motivation in the classroom. And so these authentic performance tasks should really, as much as they can, assess those understandings that we've laid out, the understandings and essential questions. And like I mentioned before, these should be very much aligned with those transfer goals that you mentioned earlier. And I think it's important to note at this point as well that stage one is not something you have to leave behind and just forget about, or that's kind of set in stone, that it's like there and we can't do anything about it. As you're coming up with these assessments for stage two, absolutely go back and change your learning goals. Absolutely do that. Because we want, in the end result of this, we want it to be really aligned in a very tight unit plan. And so you don't want to leave behind what you've done and sort of say, okay, well, it's sort of driving what I'm doing with this stage two, but I can't go back and change it. It's absolutely fine to do that if you notice that you need another transfer goal, or your transfer goal isn't exactly what you expected, or I think students should analyze this first, and I haven't asked them to analyze it in my due. In stage one, you can certainly go back and change that. So this is a quick example of a GRASPS, which is the format that they talk about. And GRASPS just stands for goal, role, audience, situation, product performance, and then there's an S on the end that stands for standards, and that's where the rubric comes in. And so that's really just means like what criteria are you using to evaluate this. And so we start, making sure that we know what goal we want students. And so here, determine the best solution for evaluating water quality. That might be your transfer goal, or evaluate evidence to come up with solutions. That might be your transfer goal that you've created for this. You're the director of the water authority. You have city council as your audience. The situation you're in is you need to gather these and conduct experiments. And then your performance is that you have a oral report and a written portion that goes along with that for that board. And so I know that the state of Rhode Island is actually requiring kids to complete performance tasks at the high school level as part of their graduation requirements. And I don't know if these are just like a senior year thing, or if they, it's 11th and 12th grade and they work on them over several years. But if you wanted to research and look into that a little bit and get some more examples, if you just look up on Rhode Island's Department of Ed website, they have a great resource that links to a lot of the rubrics and things like that they use to grade those. And I think they have some examples up there as well. Here we have just some pages for you guys to use. And on pages 99 to 100, figures G4 and G5, they have sort of some help generating ideas for performance task. And so you're going to kind of go through that. And then the alignment guide that we're going to look at is actually that page 27 that has the rubric. So we'll come back to that. But for right now, it'd just be great if you guys could think about what are a couple of ideas you might have. And I think it works with a performance task. Some people think that a summative one at the end of a shorter unit is perfect. Like if you've got a 2-week unit, one performance task at the end is probably fine. If this is a unit that's like 6 weeks, we're probably going to have multiple performance tasks, smaller ones along the way. And those smaller ones may lead up to a more overarching one. And so if we look back at the scenario example for science we just looked at, they talked about gathering the experiments. Maybe a mini performance task is the actual conducting of the experiments, and you do that after 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, you write up your analysis of those experiments. And then the final performance task is coupling that together with an actual presentation to the city council about the usability of the water. And so it's absolutely fine to have smaller segments of a performance task that will be sort of done along the way of a unit. And then have the bigger part of it, or the sort of the culminating part of it, happen at the end. Or you could just have smaller performance tasks that happen throughout. I think either one is absolutely fine. But you want to just be sure that those understandings and those transfer goals are being measured as you do this. And so use these resources and go ahead and take some time to brainstorm a performance task. Okay, so here's your turn again to generate the formative and summative assessments for your unit. And so you've got other evidence. There's a box that says other evidence, and there's a box that says performance task. That performance task box is designed just for that, just for your performance task, because that is the sort of the unique part about an understanding by design unit that measures that understanding and that transfer. And so we're going to put the performance task just in that spot. And then with the rest of your assessments, the formative, and it can be, you can have actually in other evidence, you can have quizzes and tests in there as well. It doesn't only have to be formative. So that's kind of everything else you do, self-assessments, peer assessments, anything else that happens over the course of your unit goes in other evidence, except for your performance task, which is placed in that box that's labeled performance task. And so this is the time to take some time and think about that. Just a couple things to remember. Summative assessments should directly measure your unit understandings, and so that's why we're thinking about performance tasks, not tests. It's okay to have a test and a performance task, but your test very rarely will be able to measure understanding. If you had a really great essay question, it might get at it a little bit. More often than not, tests are looking for a specific answer or set of answers, whereas understandings are a little more open-ended. And so we also want to make sure that those formative assessments should forecast what is expected on your summative assessment. And what that means is just that there's alignment, that as students are completing these formative assessments, they are kind of building towards the end result of your summative assessment. So you have exit cards asking kids questions that are going to build towards your summative assessment. You have journal prompts that are asking kids those questions. You have think, pair, shares. You have concept maps. You have graffiti activities. Things along those lines that are really going to just forecast and help build kids towards those final summative assessments. So here's your alignment guide, or just a quick check for alignment. And so valid assessment demands alignment among your stage 1 and stage 2. And so what that means is that for an assessment to be valid, we want to make sure it's actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. And so that's kind of what the idea of validity is that our measurements are actually measuring the intended target. And so if we're really searching for alignment among our ideas or our goals that we lay out in stage 1, and then also the performance task and other criteria that we have in stage 2, that'll help ensure that everything is well aligned, and so that we're not asking kids to complete something that they never learned, or that we're not asking students to write a paper about something that some skills they never actually achieved throughout the unit. And so we want to make sure that our assessment evidence is valid, and in doing that, a way to do that is to check with alignment in terms of stage 1. So now that we're kind of finished with stage 2 here, page 27 is a great way to double check your work with that rubric that's on there. And so you can take a look and see the page 27 in your high quality units book. You can take a look and see, have I completed everything I need to complete? Are all my learning goals that I've laid out in stage 1 addressed in stage 2? And so what I always say is that it's not really worth making a learning goal in stage 1 if we're not checking that students got it. Because if we don't know if they understood it or not, what's the point in teaching it? And so we want to make sure that there's some tight alignment there. So page 27 will help you with that. And then upon the completion of that, we're going to make some more predictions kind of heading into stage 3. And then we will talk briefly about creating an effective and engaging learning plan. Okay, so let's go back to the Judy Willis video again and think about, you made some predictions for stage 2 about what you felt like stage 2 is going to be about, kind of based on your knowledge of things we've talked about before, but also what you saw in the Judy Willis video. I want you to think about which of those predictions were correct and which you need to modify. And so again, I'm hoping that you're kind of keeping a journal or a running list of this stuff. And so what do you feel like, which predictions went well, which do you feel like you need to modify? And then to think about stage 3 and what predictions you can make about designing, engaging, and effective instruction based on what Judy Willis talked about. And so we've got stage 2 done. Check those predictions, see how it went, and then let's make some for stage 3. And so this might be a good time to just pause the presentation and just take a second and think about what she said. And again, go back and watch if you need to. It's always good to learn something new every time you watch something. So I think this is a really important point to think about, is that when we're teaching for understanding, it doesn't begin with information, it begins with questions about information. One of the things that schools don't do a really good job of is allowing students to ask their own questions about what they're going to learn and sort of think about what's happening. And so if we think about the things that we've come to learn and we've come to learn best, more often than not, understanding begins with what are some questions we have about that, and then we investigate those questions. And that's what leads to understanding. It's that uncoverage of what's there. It's not, here are a bunch of facts, here's how they fit together. And so as best we can when we're teaching for understanding, it's about the process of uncoverage rather than actually trying to cover stuff. So if we say this just a little bit differently, understanding kind of begins with a felt need to understand. So what does all this mean? It's kind of the beginning of all understanding. How does this relate to me? How does this fit together? And so that's kind of the way we want to begin that process. And it's not that teachers aren't going to spend time throughout a unit equipping kids with direct instruction and showing them, demonstrations and examples and walking them through problems. Absolutely that is part of any well-designed unit. But particularly to start with. We want understanding to be about something kind of a need or an itch students have. And so we want to hook them properly and to get them thinking about these essential questions that we've created for this unit. And through that, we can really begin to get at what this means to them, and what they should be understanding or what they need to understand. So I think this process works best if we can first stop and think, hey, what was the best design learning experience you've ever encountered? And so what was the design like? The tasks, the goals, what was the end result of that? And it wasn't about, so kind of try to ignore your interests or talents of the teacher. So if you were, like me and really into ancient Egypt when I was a kid, you could have done anything ancient Egypt. It could have been the worst design thing in the world, and I would have thought it was amazing. And so kind of think about that. Is it something that take your interests or the talents of the teacher aside and say, what was the best design learning experience you encountered? And it could be college, it could be post-college, it could be something that you experienced in high school and middle school and elementary school, something that just really resonated with you. And so what we're aiming for with best, how we define best, is it resulted in highly engaged and effective learning, because that's what we're aiming for with this stage, is that we're really thinking about what it means to be highly effective and engaging with our instruction. And so go ahead and journal that or discuss that and try to come up with a few characteristics. And as we're going forward in this stage 3, and you start thinking about designing activities, be thinking about if these activities really adhere to some of those characteristics of a really highly engaged and effective learning experience. As teachers, we want to be able to create learning experiences that build these frameworks of meaning in kids. And so these are just a few examples of what Tomlinson and Souza here. And this is from a book called Differentiation in the Brain. And in this book, Susan Tomlinson and some of and I should make note that the summative informative information that I gave earlier is also from their book. And so what they're talking about here is in terms of our stage 3 and what we do, we want students to come to understand the living cell as a system with interdependent parts. That has more durable and useful knowledge than someone who draws a cell and labels the parts. Or memorizes those. That I think back to when I taught geography and how terrible of a job I did with having kids color in maps. Being able to identify locations is important, but what about the locations is essential? Like why is geography destiny? Why does geography drive economy? Those are the types of things that we really should have been thinking about in that class, as opposed to worrying about coloring in maps. So the other part, students will understand history as a cycle with its roots in the past and ripples into the future. Hey, history connects. There's themes that repeat themselves. All of a sudden, history isn't, let's learn about this war, then the next one. And that's how many of us went through school, is we learned about history as this disconnected thing. And in reality, history is very much interconnected, both in terms of how it repeats itself, but how one event has ripples into the future that affect the way things are today. And if we can get students to organize their thinking around these big ideas, they also are going to be able to retain information and apply skills more rapidly, because these understandings are the glue. But more than that, if we think about from a brain learning standpoint, when students are thinking deeply and engaging multiple areas of the brain, then those understandings and skills are going to stick. They're going to stick in various areas. And so when we're teaching for effective and engaging in an effective way, and we're building towards understanding, these frameworks of meaning are what we end up with. And so when you're designing your instruction, again, you want to be fluid. You're building these frameworks. It's not what happens today, what happens tomorrow. It's how does all of this fit together to help students make sense of these big ideas that we've laid out for them. So here is really where we're going to start thinking about aligning these lessons and activities to stage 1. And so we want to make sure that all those elements in stage 1 are taught. So because if we've laid these goals out and we've created assessments for these goals, formative and summative, it's really important that we're teaching kids this stuff as well, and that these learning activities are built into our stage 3 and what we're doing. And remember that these need to be engaging to diverse populations too, that it's not just engaging to our most able or our least able learners, that everybody has sort of a place that they can find within this. And so we're looking for transfer, and so we're building for transfer. And so that transfer goal, that meaning, that should sort of be the big end result we're looking for as we teach students the skills and acquisition of knowledge that they need. And then they'll get to that point of meaning and transfer. And then they'll also be most prepared for those end of unit transfer tasks. Okay, as we're getting towards the end here, there's only a couple more things that need to happen. So you've got your stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. You thought about that, and now I want you guys to look at the entirety of that unit. And so you've done stage 1 and stage 2 with page 27, but now I'd like you guys to look at the entirety of that, including stage 3, and making sure that you've got everything in there you need. Make any necessary changes. What I'd like for you guys to do is we're going to do a peer review portion of this in a second. So that you can share and sort of learn from each other. So make sure the self-assessment happens first. You make any changes, you think about questions you have, and then in the next slide, I'm going to have you guys pair off with somebody else who's gone through this module as well, and to share these unit plans and kind of think about where you are in relationship to where you want to be. Okay, so our last step is for you guys to get together with somebody else. And you're going to use page 27 again to look at somebody else's unit. And you can do this together. You can say, hey, let's meet together again in 2 days after we've had a chance to look these over and give each other feedback and talk about that. What we want to build is a culture of collaboration. No one's perfect. No one's going to get this immediately. It's a very complex way of creating units. It takes a lot of thought to do this and to do this well. And so let's do it together where we can learn from each other. Collaboration is really the stuff that leads to the best ideas. And so we want to make sure to do that. And so, set this up however you'd like. If you have a good chunk of time to sit together with somebody else and to each look at each other's unit and look at page 27 and give some qualitative comments on there, absolutely do that. And if it's something where you want to hand each other your unit, email each other your units, and then set up a time to meet later, that would work too. But the goal is that you do this and you come back together and try to give each other feedback. And then after this process, that's when we will reconvene virtually as we set up some times to chat. And those are the chances where you can say, hey, here are the questions I have about X, or here are the questions I have about Y. And then we can address those and try to move you all to a higher level of understanding in relationship to this process. All right, so just to revisit, the big ideas from our little workshop today is that understanding is reflected in transfer, and it's based on big ideas. Your performance task reflects understanding. Attempts by the learner to make sense of teaching causes the learning, not the teaching. So there's a big difference. Just teaching stuff does not mean that they learn it. So as teachers, we want to be really sure that we're checking for understanding and that we're also giving students opportunities to make sense of it. We're thinking like a coach. Feedback, sometimes direct instruction, but what we're really aiming for is that the goal is autonomous transfer. We need to do less teaching, giving more feedback, design backward from your learning goals, not the content. And so not your textbook, not your standards, what you've laid out in terms of your learning goals. That's what we're going to design backward from. And we should assess what we value, not what's easiest to assess. I wish so much in my college courses that I could give a Scantron test. And that would be what I assess, but I know that would not prepare them for being able to write meaningful units and curriculum going forward in not only in their future College of Education classes, but also in their future lives as teachers. And so that would be really easy to assess, but it wouldn't be most beneficial for what we value and what I value. And I think that another important thing too is it's obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to the kids. And so as we're helping them to make sense of it, that checking for understanding is really important, that we're making sure that kids are being looked upon as they're learning. So that sort of ends our just little overview here and review of what we've talked about in the fall. And so what we'll do at this point is we'll set up some time, through Mariah. We'll try to set up some time where we can do some virtual conversations. And so before we do those, please come ready with questions and have gone through this, and please have had a chance to get with other people and share your work, because I think this is going to be most beneficial if we can sit down and look at it going forward, and not necessarily trying to look back at a bunch of stuff that we've gone over. So if it can be a very much a forward-looking process about here's where I am, what are my next steps I can take, what feedback can you give me to help me get there, then that's absolutely what we can do. And so I look forward to chatting with you guys in the near future. And if it's not before the end of the school year, I wish you the best in finishing things up, and hope that if I do talk to you into the summer or a little bit later, that you enjoy whatever start that you have. And if I talk to you before school's over, then hopefully it's not too overwhelming. But looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.